Today on CityCast Houston, imagine waking up at 5 a.m. during Hurricane Beryl to find a foot of water in your living room. And Beryl wasn't even a rain event, so how did that happen? Also, what if that flooding could have been avoided if city leaders had properly spent money to improve drainage? That's what happened to some communities in Northeast Houston last week. Houston Landing reporter Elena Bruess and Alice Liu of West Street Recovery are joining me to talk about how neglected ditches caused unnecessary flooding in our most vulnerable communities. It's Monday, July 15th. I'm Raheel Ramzanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. Elena, Alice, welcome into CityCast Houston. How are y'all doing?
Good. Or as good as you can be.
Alice, how about you? How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for asking.
All right, let's jump into this. Elena, after Hurricane Beryl hit, you covered flooding in Northeast Houston. What did you hear from residents? And can you paint us a picture of who you met and what they were dealing with?
Yeah, so just a couple days before the storm, I was in contact with West Street Recovery. So the day of the storm, I got a text from one of the members there, and he was like, this is the address, their house is flooding. So we drove out there, and it's kind of like you turn on the block and the entire block is flooded. The ditch itself is flooded. The street is flooded. And then because the ditch is so flooded, it has now pulled out onto the property and onto the back part of the property. And this house is on a corner, so it's almost completely surrounded by ditch. So it almost looked like a lake, just a whole lake, because there was just no difference between all these different elevations because everything was flooded. This is the Medina family, and they've been dealing with this for a long time. I mean, they were dealing with this with Harvey as well. They were really flooded during Harvey. So their whole property, including inside their home, had at least a foot of water. So when we got there, they were still drying out pieces of the house, but their bedrooms were still flooded. Their bathroom is still flooded. Their backyard, their front yard, their garage had more than a foot of water. And what was just really astounding for them and for myself as well being there was they were this is just really normal for us. We sort of just expected that this was going to happen, and now we're just going to have to deal with it. And what also was a problem was all of them had to take off work that day so that they could handle the problem of having a bunch of water in their house. So they weren't even able to go and do their normal jobs and pay their bills, right? Because they're dealing with the water that's damaging their house.
That is surprising because Beryl wasn't considered a storm that caused a lot of flooding like Harvey. Most of the damage came from wind knocking out power lines, right? But what you just described was major flooding. What happened?
It's a good question. And Alice, feel free to chime in on this as well. But the city is sort of cut up in how it is able to handle its drainage systems. And specifically on the northeast side, they have something called an open ditch drainage system. So when it rains on the street, the water is expected to pool into these ditches and then drain away. But a lot of these systems are very old and they haven't really been kept up with. So what happens is the ditches start to clog and fill up and then pool out into people's yards and homes, unlike what you might see in other parts of the community who have different drainage systems. Is that right?
Yeah, that's perfect. And just to add on to that, to give a really high overview of how drainage works in general in Houston, there's sort of the infrastructure that's managed at the county level. So that's going to be the bayous, the really big scale drainage infrastructure that many people think of. But a lot of times what we saw in Harvey, what we saw in Imelda is beyond the bayous, there's very localized street level flooding. And this is something that is experienced much more disproportionately, as Elena was saying, by folks who are living in neighborhoods that have mostly open ditch drainage. And that's because of over 2 decades of unequal maintenance of infrastructure between open ditch and underground drainage systems.
Yeah, these drainage systems are often neglected, right? What does that mean and how are they neglected?
It's a good question as well. So I think that the city used to manage these drainage systems, but then I would say more than 20 years ago, they decided to pass off how these drainage systems are managed to the homeowners themselves. So over time, there's been sort of disrepair on them because you're leaving something that is time consuming, maybe difficult to the actual homeowners. And especially in communities that have open ditch drainage, they might not have necessarily the income or the resources to be managing their own drainage systems. And so for almost more than 20 years, that is what's been going on. And they've been having to handle their own systems, and it's been really difficult.
Hold on. That is wild to me that homeowners are responsible for maintaining these systems, right? These ditch systems on their own. Like, how do you even do that? Alice, what does that mean? How do you maintain this?
So the way that Public Works divides up these different levels of maintenance that open ditches require to remain functional at all, right? There's kind of 3 levels of maintenance. The first would be the level that might actually be feasible for homeowners to do themselves. So this is just things like clearing basic vegetation, keeping ditches clear of things like leaves and trash. And this is something that is acceptable, though it is harder for a lot of the folks that we work with who are older. Maybe they're blind, maybe they have other disabilities or medical issues, right? But what's wild is that even beyond this basic level of maintenance, for the past 20 years, the city has expected things like actually regrading the ditches, right? So this is something that means deepening ditches, making sure that the ditches are essentially restored to their original level of, how steep the slope is, clearing out like dirt and, some really nasty stuff that can accumulate in these ditches. These are all things that the city actually uses heavy machinery to do. And these were things that was part of the responsibility that was passed on to homeowners. And just to put this in the scope of thinking about this as the sort of erosion of the responsibilities that we can depend on the state for. Drainage infrastructure like electricity, like sewage, like water infrastructure, these are things that don't just impact people at the level of the individual or the level of the home, right? If a ditch is clogged in one person's yard, that can lead to flooding along the entire street. And so we need to treat it as a problem that is collective and not individual.
Alice, from what you see supporting residents at West Street Recovery, how often does this happen to these residents?
Well, a lot of the people that we've been working with basically have experienced some level of flooding in their homes on and off since Allison. So for the past 25 years, right? Since the time that West Street Recovery has existed as an organization, we've had to respond to Hurricane Harvey, then Tropical Storm Imelda, then the massive level of loss of drinking water access that happened after Winter Storm Uri, the Christmas freeze just this past year, derecho in May, and now Hurricane Beryl. And so when Elena is saying that for a lot of the residents that we work with, this is a source of constant fear and anxiety, that's not at all an exaggeration. Especially after Hurricane Harvey, there were high levels of PTSD, anxiety, depression, people dealing with losing family members, and not just having to overcome repeated flooding, but constantly being anxious about the future. And not even hurricanes, but even just heavy rains can really bring a lot of anxiety for folks.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, just a summer storm, right? And we see these pop up so often here in the city of Houston. Are there houses getting flooded or at least creeping up and causing that anxiety just in a normal storm?
So usually homes actually flooding would only happen at a higher level disaster, as we've seen with Tropical Storm Imelda or with this past hurricane. But what's much more frequent, which ties back to this issue of open ditches, is street flooding, which we are really trying to raise awareness of not just home flooding, but also street flooding as a huge public health issue. Because what we see with standing water is oftentimes kids waiting for the school bus are having to wade through standing water just to get to school. Oh. It's impeding people leaving their communities, even leaving their driveways. And it also poses a hazard because this water carries a lot of the environmental toxins that we see from EJ sources in Northeast Houston. It breeds mosquitoes. There's a lot of issues that come with street flooding as well.
Alice, when we talk about these communities in Northeast Houston, which neighborhoods are they exactly?
Yeah, so the south boundary of what we as an organization consider Northeast Houston would be the 5th Ward, Kashmere Gardens area. And then we extend as far north as Lakewood, Settigast, and Northwood Manor would be the northern boundary.
Now, is this happening in a lot of communities, or Is there a racial and socioeconomic factor at play as well?
Yeah. So what you're seeing with a lot of these communities, especially on the Northeast side, it's mostly brown and black communities that are dealing with it, lower income communities, and people who probably just don't have the resources to be handling this. I mean, you're not seeing this type of situation in communities like the Heights. Like it's not the same situation. So not only is this a massive problem structurally, it's the fact that this structural problem is happening in communities that have less resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Drainage and disasters and flooding is actually, especially in Houston, a really big contributor to deepening the wealth divide between races, right? There was a research paper that was published after Hurricane Harvey where we saw that on average, because of how aid and insurance was distributed differently, white families actually, on average, increased in wealth, whereas the hurricane was a huge loss of wealth, damage to property for Black and Brown communities. And this is why it's not just Northeast Houston, but Southeast Houston as well. If you look at a map of where open ditches are, it's absolutely not just Northeast Houston where this is a problem, but it absolutely is neighborhoods outside of the Houston area, outside of the white and wealthy parts of Houston.
I hate spam, and I know you do as well. And guess what? Spam starts with your personal data being sold every day. Data brokers collect and sell your personal information to third parties, such as your SSN, address, phone numbers, health and financial records, and much more. These insights are then used by scammers, total strangers, insurance companies, banks, businesses, and even the government to target you with, you guessed it, spam. It's time to protect your data, your time, and your sanity with Incogni. Incogni scrubs your personal info from the web. Simple as that. Incogni takes only 3 minutes to set up, tackles 180 data brokers and people search sites, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. Get Incogni today and never look back. Use code CITYCAST for 55% off the annual plan at incogni.com. That's spelled INCOGNI.com. That's incogni.com and use code CITYCAST for 55% off their annual plan. All right, so why isn't the city doing anything about it? Or what is the city doing about this? Because this seems like a massive issue, Elena.
It's a good question. And Alice, I'll definitely want you to chime in here. But I think finally, after these organizations like West Street Recovery and the Northeast Action Collective, they've been pushing, along with residents in these communities, for years to get this looked at. They have been pushing and pushing. They've been going to city council meetings. They've been going to commissioner's court. They've been asking for something to change. And finally, 2 years ago, or was it last year, Alice? Last year, they were able to do something about it. And they were able to actually put aside money that would be going to this specific problem. Alice, if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I myself am not a resident of Northeast Houston, so I really want to lift up that the Northeast Action Collective was formed in 2018 by survivors of Hurricane Harvey. These are people who are living on the front lines of these increased climate disasters that we're seeing, who not only came together to help support each other to recover from this devastating storm, but also to demand more from the city and recognize that the devastation that we see repeatedly from climate disasters, that's not something that's natural, that's not something that's normal, and it's not at all acceptable. And what makes these storms really into disasters is the decades of neglect that we've seen, the government failing to invest in infrastructure, even at a baseline level, right? Forget actually investing in climate resilient infrastructure, but we're not even maintaining it at the baseline level that it was 20 years ago, back when a lot of these drainage systems were first built. And as of the past few years, through directly engaging with the city of Houston's budget process, the hard work and determination and demand for dignity of these Hurricane Harvey survivors has actually come somewhat to fruition. So starting last year, the city created a ditch reestablishment program where they're going to start putting ditches once again on a regular maintenance cycle. And that was kickstarted with $20 million of investment. This year, this program was funded again with $35 million. And through fighting and getting our city councilor to sponsor an amendment, we were able to get an additional $8 million passed for sort of higher level ditch rehabilitation as well.
So what happened to that money? Has it been put to use already? Has the city helped out? Because it looked like it didn't work, right? Because the homes are flooded.
Well, I think this is going to take a long time, but I do think some money was not actually being allocated to the ditch program, and that money is now getting caught up in the courts.
Whoa, tell me more about that. Wait, hold on. What? This money just, there's another layer. Tell me about this.
What happened with this lawsuit was Mayor Turner was pooling money from this fund because he found language in the charter and the way that it was written that he didn't actually have to put aside money like was promised, like voters voted for. And instead, he was using that money for other things that he said that the city needed. And that accumulated in $100 million that was not actually put into the work for the ditches.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so it's sort of
like I can't help but laugh. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the city doesn't want to use the money or do the work. That's
if
kind
they
of
had
what
done
they're
that
saying.
work, if they had done that work, Alice, would these residents have fared better after at least this storm?
I mean, absolutely, right? Like when government invests in infrastructure, makes sure that these systems are up to date, absolutely there's immediate results. But something that I do want to flag is that ditches in general require maintenance much more often than underground drainage, right? Elena, you were saying that you saw a lot of these ditches are clogged up with a lot of vegetation, with dirt. And this is something that can only be expected, especially after a storm, wind event, rain event as big as this one. And so unfortunately, with open ditches, there's really never going to be a permanent solution. Keeping these ditches functional and graded at a level where they can carry water, that's a constant uphill battle. But the very bottom line is that the city is doing everything in its power, frankly, to not invest the money that voters have approved multiple times and is written into the charter.
And now you're seeing what happened to the Medina family, where like I texted the daughter, one of the daughters of the family 2 days ago, and I'm like, how was it last night sleeping with a flooded house? And she's like, well, I woke up, it smells really, really bad. And when I got out of bed, I stepped on a bunch of worms that had been like brought into the house through the flooding. And just imagine, like, this girl's 17. She does not want to have to be dealing with this right now. It's summer break. She has a bunch of younger siblings and nieces and nephews that she's helping take care of. They're all trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to charge their iPad so these kids can just, settle down for a second and watch a little show. Like it's all these tiny little things that are building up. And the fact that these are little kids that are dealing with just like really gross water in their home is incredibly unfair. So that alone is just what is very hard to grasp, I think, when you're writing about this.
Our listeners right now are going through a lot with getting their power restored through their own struggles right now after Hurricane Beryl. Why should this matter to them, Alice?
Yeah, I think as someone who myself, I've lived in Houston for the past 9 years now. And I think I want to return to the idea that this isn't something that is just a part of nature or even should be accepted as just a part of living in Houston, right? It's not normal that when we check the weather and we see that temperatures are going to dip below freezing, we all in a mass panic have to go wait in line at HEB and stock up on water because at this point we expect there to be some level of power outages, right? It's not normal that in the past 2 months, in the grand scheme of things, 2 relatively mild disasters have led to large-scale power outages in huge swaths of Houston, this time with deadly heat advisories, right? All of these things have become essential elements of living in Houston, and whether this increased impact of climate risk, being on the front lines of climate disasters, and aging and completely inadequate infrastructure that doesn't meet our needs, whether that happens through stepping in 6 inches of water after waking up, or whether that happens through having to suffer through heat and power outages. I think we have to recognize that we may be in different boats. We absolutely experience disasters at completely different levels of vulnerability and comfort. Disasters aren't equalizers, but at the same time, we're in different boats and we're all in this same ocean. And we should view this as a battle that we're all fighting together, where we can demand more from the government. We can step up to help each other. And we shouldn't be asked to be this damn resilient all the time.
Elena, why should this impact our listeners, or why should they care about what's happening in Northeast Houston?
Well, Alice said it really well. I think in the end, it's like families shouldn't have to wake up in the middle of the night and deal with feet of water in their house, and they shouldn't have to put their kids on, I don't know, a high table because they don't want them putting their little feet in the water. I think something that is important for a lot of Houstonians is having a sense of home and a sense of dignity in their property. And that is really hard to have when it is again and again and again being taken away from them because of the way that this city has often handled storms. You know, the Medinas own their home. They don't have the money to move somewhere else. They've had that home for over 10 years, and it matters a lot to them. That is a place where their children grew up. That is a place where they call safe. And right now, they're dealing with something unimaginable. And I think that everyone in Houston should be able to understand that feeling, is that everyone should be able to feel safe in their homes, and they should feel like their families are protected. And when it's happening in one part of Houston, I just feel like it's kind of happening to all of us.
Alice, are there any plans ever to put these drainage systems underground and not have these open ditches anymore? Is that something that has been talked about?
Okay, that's a huge question. We don't really have consensus between our disaster recovery staff and the residents that we work with. There really are mixed opinions. And at least within the next 10 years, there is this looming question of feasibility. There are thousands of miles of ditches in Houston. And I think our priority right now is at least having them adequately maintained and reestablished. In my personal opinion, given the factors of environmental pollutants, all of these things that make open ditches worse than underground sewage, even when they are perfectly maintained, I think given the specific conditions of Northeast Houston, underground drainage would be better, but it isn't something that we're necessarily pushing for because it is a monumental task.
Alice, what other issues are our most vulnerable communities facing with natural disasters?
Well, we're seeing increasingly the dangers of extreme temperature, which comes with power outages. I really want to emphasize how dangerous losing power for even 24 hours is for a lot of the residents that we work with. A lot of older residents over the age of 60, many of them have diabetes and need their insulin refrigerated. Many of them require a CPAP machine at night to be able to breathe. Many of them need to go to dialysis 2 or 3 times a week. All of these things are impossible without dependable power, right? And so, yeah, just want to emphasize the health dangers of losing power, especially when it's really hot or really cold outside.
And then Alice, tell me a little bit more about West Street Recovery and how y'all are helping communities become more resilient on their own as a storm moves through. Tell me more about West Street Recovery.
Yes, one of my favorite topics. Well, obviously, a huge chunk of our work goes to disaster response and recovery, but we really try to use the disaster recovery process as a way of building long-term community power. So for us, this question of meeting material needs of of people really goes hand in hand with organizing and advocacy and teaching people how to fight for themselves and fight with each other and actually demand more from the state, which is something that I've been saying throughout this interview. In addition to disaster response and recovery, we've also been focusing a lot more on preparedness. And so we have been, for the past 3 years, building up essentially these disaster resilience hubs that are in residents' garages or living rooms. We've been equipping these hubs with rooftop solar and batteries, which came really in handy during the power outages this time. And these hubs also have things like kayaks for water rescues, 1 kilowatt hour batteries that we've been distributing to people in the wake of Beryl, and then food and water and basic medical equipment as well.
Awesome. Elena, Alice, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
That was Elena Bruess, environmental reporter at Houston Landing, and Alice Liu of West Street Recovery. I've listed links to learn more about West Street Recovery and to read all of Elena's work in our show notes. And hey, as we start this week, I know a lot of y'all are still in recovery mode, so please check out our website, houston.citycast.fm, for recovery tips after Hurricane Beryl, and share it with your friends and family as well. That will do it for today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new.